Today, we are talking about automatically maintained behaviors. I'm gonna have to sit crisscross applesauce also, I think. That's what I'm feeling. Let me arrange my Zoom controls. Why is it, where'd they go away?
Oh, yeah. You might, if you hit escape, they might pop back up, or if you hover near the top.
Sorry. One more time. There we go. That's what I wanted. Okay. We're going to talk about automatically maintained behavior. So, we're gonna have a lot of fun, like this picture. I love this picture. It just looks like so much fun. Hopefully, we're gonna just come up with a definition of what is it, what are behaviors that are automatically maintained, that fourth function that we all, that is mysterious to all of us. It is different than the other four functions, so I think it's worth looking at separately. So we're going to do that, figure out a definition. We're going to look at assessment of automatically maintained behaviors, and then some treatments and treatment implications, considerations, and then we'll look through some examples of different treatment packages to kind of get our wheels turning about how we can intervene more effectively with these behaviors. Okie dokie. All right, so thanks for the thumbs up, Rob. That's great feedback. I love that. So let's start by, you can put it in the chat or shout it out. Let's list what comes to mind when you think of automatically reinforced behaviors. What behaviors could we list if we're thinking of behaviors with that function? Automatic.
Flapping your hands in front of your eyes.
Flapping?
Yeah.
Flapping your hands in front of your eyes, okay?
Nose
What else?
picking.
Nose picking. Okay.
Holly says hand flapping, vocal stimulation, swinging a string in front of your face.
Cool.
Rocking back and forth.
Yeah, I was gonna say that.
Rocking. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Okay.
And Danielle says climbing.
Climbing. Nice. I like that example. Okay, cool. So definitely there's certain behaviors that come to mind when we think of behaviors that are automatically reinforced. But we want to look a little bit deeper than that, right? So we can never just look at the topography of a behavior of just what it looks like and know what the function is. You know, we have to do that analysis piece. So we're gonna look at how we do that. So thinking of those behaviors and thinking of how we might do the next step of starting to analyze, let's try and choose the best definition of an automatically maintained behavior, or a behavior that's maintained by automatic reinforcement. I should have numbered these. That would have been better, but you can number them and I will figure it out.
You want answers in the chat? You want us to call them out?
Either.
4.
I'd say the first one.
Okay. 1, 4.
2.
2.
2. Interesting.
Maybe all of them.
Cool. Okay. Nice. This is exactly what I wanted. I wanted, and I wanted confusion to ensue. No, I wanted to find out. So it really is like, these are all possible definitions, right? Of
Mhm.
an automatically maintained behavior. Like it's, when we talk about these, it's hard to pin down what we're talking about, right? So
Yeah.
what we're going to proceed using this drum roll number 4. Okay, so a behavior which directly produces its own reinforcement and it requires no social mediation. So this is the first piece of the definition. There's going to be multiple pieces to how we're going to define this, but this is the first piece. And this idea actually comes from Skinner directly, from Science and Human Behavior. Of this idea of there's certain behavior that doesn't contact social consequences. It's just the behavior is the thing that produces its own reinforcement. So if you look back at these, those many times, so we got a lot of the responses when we thought of the automatically maintained behaviors. We thought of a lot of repetitive motor movements or repetitive vocal behaviors, which very well could be automatically maintained, but we don't know for sure. So that can't be a definition. A behavior that seems to result in sensory stimulation, sure, this could be again, but we can't observe that sensory stimulation, right? So if that seems to be the case, then we would have to do further analysis. And a behavior that happens when a person is alone, again, maybe. This is going to lead us into the next part of this definition. But again, it might not necessarily be the case. So we don't know for sure. So we're going to proceed with this definition. The first part of how we're looking at this is this the consequence piece. So nobody is involved in delivering the reinforcement. The behavior produces it. Okay, so the second part of this definition is going to come from the analysis of the function. So originally in ABA, right, the original way that we as a science devised to identify the function of behavior is through functional analysis, which is this system of controlling all of the conditions and then applying each reinforcer following a behavior to see which reinforcer increases or maintains a certain behavior, right? So this graph that you're looking at here comes from, the like foundational study in functional analysis, so this is when in every study that you read, when they're like, we did the functional analysis according to Iwata et al. 1994, like this is the seminal functional analysis paper. So I just kind of wanted to review this of how we as a science came to be able to determine functions at all, right? So we have those 4 conditions listed there. You see academic, alone, social disapproval, and play. And that just means like in that first condition in the upper left, that means that demands were placed and then removed when the behavior occurred. So they were reinforcing by the removal of demands. So that child number 1, you see that the behavior is not happening in any of those other conditions except when demands were placed and then removed. So that is our escape function. Child number 4, the one right below that, that's our alone condition. So that's meaning you can see that the behavior, this is self-injury, by the way. I didn't say that. The behavior in question was self-injury in this paper. That self-injury is happening at relatively low rates in the other functions, or I'm sorry, in the other conditions at the bottom. And then I wish I had like a pointer. Is that a thing? And then I'm looking at child number 4 here. And then it happens mostly in the alone condition. Child number 2 in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that the behavior is happening kind of undifferentiated, as how we refer to it. It's just happening kind of randomly and consistently across all the different conditions. And then child number 5, there's a little bit of differentiation there. You can see social disapproval, that bottom right-hand corner. When the behavior happens, it's addressed with scolding, so comments. So this behavior would be being maintained by like negative attention. So not negative, I shouldn't say negative, but it's being maintained by attention. So you're getting a view of different functions of behavior here. And this is one of the first times where you see these two patterns that we end up calling automatically reinforced behavior. So child number 2 and child number 4 represent 2 kids where we would call, if we got these results in our functional analysis, we would call these automatic, we would call this an automatic function. So there's 2 scenarios. The first is, again, the bottom left, child number 4, when the behavior happens almost only or most when they're alone in the alone condition. And then the other scenario is the upper right, child number 2. And that is when it happens undifferentiated. You can't identify if it's happening more or less in any one condition. It's kind of happening a lot across all conditions. So this is kind of and you can see already like this, the waters are muddy, right? It should feel that way of these are not, it's not nearly as clear as when the demand is removed or attention is applied. There's these other just scenarios that we as science, we've labeled these 2 different scenarios as automatic, the function. So we're going to move forward with that. So those are kind of the 2 things we want to keep in mind when we think of what an automatically maintained behavior is. It's something that doesn't require social mediation, no social consequences, and it's either something that happens most when a kid is alone, or it happens kind of anytime in any condition. And the other relevant thing to note here is with the alone condition and the across all conditions scenarios. In the alone condition, typically this is a state of reinforcer deprivation. Okay, so like in this experiment, the kid is in a room alone with no reinforcers and no people. So when you hear that word enriched environment, most of you have heard that. This is the opposite of that. There's no reinforcement available. Whereas in the second scenario of an automatically maintained behavior across all conditions, lots of different reinforcers are available. There's attention being applied, there's access to tangibles, there's all sorts of things, and this behavior is still occurring at those rates. So that reinforcement piece will come up again. It's helpful to keep in mind. Okay. And if anyone has any questions at any time, just put them in the chat, and Rob, you can like flag me down. We don't have to wait until the end. I just want to make sure everything's clear here.
Gina, just so you know, we can see your mouse cursor, and you could
You
also
can?
use, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, great. I'll use that. Thank you. Okay, so that's the functional analysis piece. Now, obviously, we don't do functional analyses because we don't have a laboratory and there are ethical things. So there's lots of reasons that there's a whole nother training why we don't do functional analyses. So how do we identify functions? We do FBAs. We do functional behavior assessments. So we assess a little more indirectly. So just looking through, but the same sort of thing kind of transfers over. Well, that's what we're looking for, right? So instead of creating that contingency in a functional analysis setting, in that laboratory setting, we're looking for those contingencies in the environment through this ABC analysis, right? We're looking and waiting for them to happen and recording them of what the antecedent was, the demand was placed, the behavior occurred, the demand was removed, right? So we're identifying those contingencies in the environment instead of creating them in a laboratory. So that's how so when we think of how do we identify when we're doing our FBAs and we're thinking, I think this might be an automatically maintained behavior. What are we looking for, right? So antecedent wise, this might be one of those scenarios where you hear there was no antecedent, which obviously we all here should be at the point where we automatically translate that into either it occurs, there's lots of different antecedents, or I didn't observe any specific antecedent. It wasn't an observable antecedent. Or it could just be any in the room, like every moment is an antecedent. There are conditions, right? The lights are on or off, there are sounds, there are smells, all of those things are antecedent conditions, right? So if it appears that there's no identifiable antecedent, it could just be that this thing is happening in lots of different conditions. Or it could, and that translates right back to our functional analysis, the graph that we just looked at, right? So, or this could occur most when a kid is alone, or that alone condition also translates to a lack of reinforcers. So in the absence of other reinforcers, whenever they might be having to like wait and there's no access to the typical reinforcers, on the bus, like there's certain places where the access to reinforcement is really low, like overall access to reinforcement. So looking for things like that. Consequences, there might be, again, here, like there was no consequence. There's nothing observable. Like we couldn't observe a social consequence. Nothing was applied or removed that we could see. Or there's no consistently, it's not consistent. Our we might have taken a bunch of ABCs and attention was applied in 50% and there was no attention in 50% of them. Or, tangibles were accessed some of the time, but not really. And you're like, what the heck is going on here? It's not attention, it's not tangibles. Like it's undifferentiated. I can't differentiate between those conditions. So and then that could be a cue for us of like, it's that across all conditions situation. This could be pointing me to an automatic function. And remembering that we can't observe sensory input. So not jumping too soon to the sensory or automatic conclusion of like, oh, they're obviously doing that. Like flapping our hands in front of our eyes, we automatically think that is a sensory and automatically reinforced behavior because we're assuming a sensation. We're assuming that a sensation is taking place and that is the maintaining consequence. But we have to look at the analysis to determine that. We can't assume that. So keeping that in mind. And then just interestingly, I think it's interesting to look at the FAST and see, the section in there that kind of is asking about this function. Again, points back to those conditions in the functional analysis of do they engage in this behavior when no one's around, when they're alone, when no one's watching? Do they engage in this over other types of reinforcers, leisure activities, right? All the time, like that undifferentiated condition is happening all the time. That means that reinforcer is out competing all of these other reinforcers that might be available in the environment. Do they continue to engage in the problem behavior if attended to? Again, so even if you're not paying attention to it. So kind of ruling out that attention piece. And then high rates regardless of what's going on in the environment. Again, it's outcompeting any other potential reinforcers. So that's the assessment piece. So again, keep those things in mind, those potential consequences and reinforcers when you do this part of the FBA. So I won't even say some of the time, I'm going to go with some of the time I see automatic, but this applies to kind of all of the functions. So this is just like a note about your FBA, this section of the FBA in general, is that when you check your hypothesized functions here, especially the primary, I need to see that reflected in the antecedent and consequence analysis. So if automatic is in here, either primary or secondary, I want to hear some of those things that we just talked about. I don't want to hear, well, demands are being placed. That's my antecedent analysis. And I said, okay, well, that seems like it's pointing towards a different function. That seems like it might be an escape function. So if you think it's automatic, we should be explaining in the antecedent and consequence analysis why that is using those pieces that we just talked about. So it's a little note for your FBA. Oh, and this is our first keyword that I actually thought of doing this time. High five, Gina. So it's going to be some of my favorite animals, and the first one is my very favorite animal, which is a shark. All right, moving on. Okay, so some things to think about with the assessment of these behaviors that are potentially automatically retained. So that make them different from the other three functions. With the other three functions, when we identify what that reinforcer is, what the maintaining reinforcer is, we also get that bonus knowing, we get the bonus information of the class of whether it's positive or negative, right? So with escape, we're looking at negative reinforcement usually. And then with access to tangibles and attention, we're usually looking at a positive reinforcement, right? Which makes, and the reason that's relevant is because it gives us an in to our interventions. We know what to do for our interventions so much more readily when we have that information. You know, if the maintaining reinforcer is a positive reinforcer, we need a positive reinforcer. With automatic reinforcement, again, it's not as clear. It's this either it's happening only when they're alone, in which case it's probably a sensory thing. It's not observable. We can't observe what the reinforcer is, or it's happening across all of these conditions, which maybe you've already thought of this. Rob brought this up when we talked about it. Is it could be that there are other reinforcers at play of the other functions, right? So it's just less clear. So it really, and this is coming out in like more recent literature, there's a whole nother rabbit hole of like automatically maintained behaviors. It's kind of just a label for these behaviors where, and it's not as specific, it's not as accurate a label as the other functions for what it is. And it actually should just trigger further analysis. If we do that initial analysis and say, oh, this is automatic, that just means we don't know what the reinforcer is, right? Like even if we are pretty sure it's a sensory, it might be like a positive reinforcer of a sensory, it's something that feels good. We still don't have a handle on what that is. We can't observe it. We can't know like topographically what it is. So we can't replace it in the same way that we would with any of those other reinforcers. So what implications does this have on intervention is the question. And at this point, it should be pretty clear. It just complicates things. It makes intervention harder than with the other functions. So with the other three functions, what's the typical process that all of you should, this is like, you kind of all do this in your sleep at this point, hopefully, of when you have a maladaptive behavior, step one, we need to know the function. Obviously you identify the problem, define it, the behavior, determine the function. And then once you have one of those three functions, attention, escape, tangibles, you just pick a replacement behavior and you use the same reinforcer, right? The same reinforcer for a socially acceptable behavior. And you do your DRA, right? You pick your socially acceptable replacement behavior, you prompt it, you do whatever you need to do to get it to happen, and you direct the reinforcement that was already happening for the problem behavior to that new behavior, and bingo. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, right? Our jobs are just that easy. So reductionist, sorry. But that is, you know, in a lot of cases, if we get the function right and we do our reinforcement right, this works, you know, this is a little bit the magic bullet, this DRA. So but you know, as I said, with these automatically reinforced behaviors, this nice clear path is not there. So it requires more creativity and more analysis and more flexibility and lots of other things. So what we're going to do is kind of go over some of these different interventions. We're just going to review some of the reinforcement procedures that are going to come up in the in the studies that we're going to look at, and then review the roles of extinction and punishment with treating these behaviors. Okay, so these are our tools in our tool belt for treating automatically maintained behaviors. Okay, so non-contingent reinforcement, NCR stands for non-contingent reinforcement. Contingent means it only happens when, right? So contingent reinforcement means it only happens when a certain behavior happens. So non-contingent means it's happening on the time-based schedule unrelated to when the target behavior happens. It's usually just a timer, right? Typically, NCR is starts very dense schedule, so it's happening very frequently, and then it thins out. This can be done with most of these reinforcement procedures, because the others are differential reinforcement, and we'll get into that. But so this can be done with or without extinction of the target behavior. So you're delivering reinforcement just on a schedule, and then you're going to have to make a treatment decision of if and when this problem behavior does happen, are we going to allow reinforcement to occur, or are we going to somehow block that and put extinction in place? So the literature discussing non-contingent reinforcement, NCR, talks about the effectiveness could be due to just decreasing the motivation to access the reinforcer by delivering that reinforcement non-contingently, just at a higher rate, right? So if you get reinforcement for free, your motivation will, satiation occurs, the MO decreases, and the likelihood of that behavior kind of decreases on its own. And then also extinction, right? So they're accessing the same reinforcer for free, and then when the problem behavior happens, in the cases where they are choosing to implement extinction, it does not contact. There's no reinforcement. NCR can be in the cases where it's not used or it's not indicated. It's pretty difficult to implement, especially in cases where it's problem behavior that you're trying to decrease, because you have to start really dense, right? You need to make sure they're contacting reinforcement more frequently than they are with the problem behavior. So it's difficult to implement initially when it has to be very dense, and then the reinforcers can be the maintaining reinforcer, which means when I say maintaining reinforcer, it means the problem behavior, the reinforcer that's maintaining the problem behavior. So if it's an escape behavior, escape would be the maintaining reinforcer. Tangibles, whatever it is, attention. So the maintaining reinforcer corresponds to the function. So with NCR, it can be that maintaining reinforcer, but it can also, many times, arbitrary reinforcers are used as well. Okay. And then we have, that was our second keyword. Our second keyword is loon, which is one of my, Ashley, oh no, Ashley, you're in the car. Usually Ashley has a loon behind her, I think, when she's on Zoom, but not right now. Okay, so that's our second keyword, loons. Our next intervention here we're going to review is differential reinforcement of other behavior, or DRO. So when we hear other, we really should be inserting the word any other, right? If I did your RBT training, we talked about this a lot. This is reinforcement of any other behavior. As long as you're doing anything other than that thing we're trying to get rid of, you're going to get that reinforcer. So this is, again, intervals. So typically this is, we pick some interval that is less than the frequency of the problem behavior currently. And we say, if you make it 5 minutes without exhibiting this behavior, you access that reinforcer. Again, this can be done with the maintaining reinforcer or arbitrary reinforcers. And this is really, in the literature with DRO, is where the discussion of preference assessment starts to pop up, which is going to be really relevant to us when we look at our research with these treatments. Is sometimes, so originally when all of these reinforcement procedures, preference assessments were not super common. And so as we've gotten better at preference assessments and started to implement them, our reinforcement procedures have gotten more effective. Obviously, should be obvious, right? We're figuring out better stimuli to use as reinforcers that are more likely to be effective reinforcers. So these procedures are getting more effective as we're getting better at implementing and pairing preference assessments with our reinforcement procedures. Again, we have to make the choice of whether or not to use extinction. And the same thing, the effectiveness could be the extinction could be part of the effectiveness of this procedure if it's being used. And then reinforcement, you're reinforcing the inter-response time, the increase of the inter-response time between the behaviors. So that reinforcement piece is the other part that seems to be functioning there. And then DRA, which is my favorite. So this is a differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. So this is contingent, again, contingent reinforcement, which is a confusing word, but I think we should all be used to it. So again, contingent just means only happens when the appropriate response. So contingent reinforcement of an appropriate response, and we choose that appropriate response based on a socially recognizable appropriate way to access the same reinforcer. So it replaces the maladaptive behavior. We figure out what the function of the maladaptive behavior is, and then we deliver the exact same reinforcement for a different, more socially recognizable and appropriate behavior. Okay. So in this case, it's the maintaining reinforcer. It's not an arbitrary reinforcer. That's kind of the distinction between this one and the other reinforcement procedures. DRA historically has been done with extinction. But it can be done without extinction. More recent research has done, we've done differential reinforcement where you're doing the differential reinforcement of the replacement behavior. You're prompting that replacement behavior to happen. So this is, like when a kid is running away from out of their seat or whatever it is, and you teach them to raise their hand and ask for a break. The break is the biggest example here that I always use is if you have a kid running away, just ask them to get them to ask to get to run away, right? If they need to get out of there and they can just ask to get out of there, that will replace any other behavior that they're doing in order to escape from that situation. So there have been studies where the problem behavior is still allowed to occur, and they're accessing that reinforcement, and DRA is still used, or DRA is still effective when other dimensions of the reinforcer are adjusted. So remember, when you're differentially reinforcing, right, you don't have to just shut off reinforcement for the other behavior that you're trying to get rid of. You can turn it down. As long as it's just, it could be less magnitude, it could be less frequent. As long as you're turning down some of that reinforcement in some way, the quality could be lower. It could be a slightly less preferred reinforcer. So there are scenarios where the problem behavior is still getting reinforced, but as long as we're making sure that our replacement behavior is getting better, more frequent, or high quality reinforcement, these can still be effective. Okay.
Gina, can I ask a question?
Yepers.
So when we talk about the maintaining reinforcer,
Yeah.
if we're talking about something that is automatically reinforced, then we could not implement that, correct?
Right. So, right, exactly. So that's where typically with these procedures, when you're using these with an automatically maintained behavior, we're using arbitrary reinforcement, which is why these preference assessments, the importance of preference assessments has been really, really highlighted in the, recently, because if we get really good at identifying competing reinforcers, it's going to make any of those other reinforcement procedures more effective. But that's where these other things come in too, right? So it's very, it's been, the use of punishment and extinction have been more prevalent with automatically maintained behaviors than any other function of behavior, because they're so hard you know, all of you know we're required to do reinforcement, right? We're required to try reinforcement procedures first, but because we can't drill down on exactly what that reinforcer, that maintaining reinforcer is for automatically maintained behaviors, other procedures are kind of added on to those reinforcement procedures, any of the ones we just discussed, in order to increase the effectiveness of the intervention. So there's research on all of those, for each of those reinforcement procedures that we just discussed. There are research articles where punishment was added. And in most instances, that punishment procedure, the addition of that procedure, increase the effectiveness many times to 100%. So punishment, there's lots of different forms of punishment that have been used. Response cost, different kinds of restraints, like very brief restraints, a variety of different things, nothing enormous, you know, we're not talking about like electric shock here, you know, like nothing. It's typically like very mild aversives that are applied in some way, and it could just be like, you know, loss of a preferred item, anything like that. Again, there is there's a lot of research showing that the addition of punishment to reinforcement procedures increases the effectiveness of the overall treatment, especially for automatically maintained behaviors. And there is some limited research showing a preference for treatments with a punishment component. There's a ton of work cited here at the end. So if you guys want to look through any of these articles we talk about, you can. But can anybody think of why that preference might exist for a punishment, the addition of a punishment component to a treatment protocol? Any ideas?
I think maybe like a feeling that it would be more successful, like, oh, like if it's a person who can kind of talk about their own behavior, at least, you know, you could say like, oh, well, yeah, I'm not going to do that thing anymore, but I really won't do it if you added punishment, maybe.
Yeah, it's the effectiveness. It's just going back to what we just said, because it's the increase in effectiveness. So if it works more quickly and more efficiently, it could be that certain individuals might prefer that because it's going to be a briefer, more efficient treatment process. So kind of the benefit of getting to that outcome might outweigh the short-term aversiveness of the punishment procedure. So there's, again, there more research is needed about that. This is not just licensed to go do punishment procedures. Please don't do that. There are obvious ethical implications. We are all required to pursue reinforcement-based procedures before any more restrictive procedures. That includes punishment and extinction. But we're weighing the severity of the behavior also, right? So there's that question as well of if you have a really potentially dangerous behavior, that might be a scenario where you look at applying some mildly aversive punishment, and the benefit of that reducing that potentially dangerous behavior might outweigh. So that's a discussion you would have with your treatment team, with your client and their caregivers. It's a process, but that's a consideration. And then again, the preferences of clients and their caregivers. So keep those things in mind as we talk through these things. Okay, so let's look through some research here. So this is just this is like looking at 3 different types of behaviors that are sometimes or most of the time found to be maintained automatically. And we'll look at some of the treatment packages that have been used. And this is just to kind of get your wheels turning as to how you might initially decide on an intervention, and then how you might pivot and change that intervention, or how you might add additional components. I think we get kind of stuck on like a single intervention mindset of like, well, we're doing this reinforcement procedure, we're doing a DRO, and it's like, okay, but can we also do an NCR on top of that? Like, what if we added a response cost? So like this idea of more complex treatment packages when you have those tricky behaviors that are more difficult to treat. Okay, so with self-injurious behavior, so there's a ton of research on self-injurious behaviors in ABA because of the social implications, right? They're really impactful and potentially dangerous. So there's a lot of research looking at how to treat them. So foundationally, the research tells us that about 25% of cases of self-injurious behavior are automatically reinforced, which for my, like, personally, this surprised me. I thought it would be more than that, because when I think of self-injurious behavior, I think of like stereotypy, and it can be like repetitive in the same way. So it's actually a lower percentage than I thought it would be. So again, functional analyses of self-injurious behavior, you can't distinguish between positive or negative reinforcement. There's different pain tolerances that we're working on that now, of trying to figure out if hypo or hypersensitivity to pain is a factor here, and if we can get a clearer idea of whether that reinforcer is positive or negative, but we can't typically tell if the self-injury is removing something more aversive that's happening, or if the addition of that sensory stimulus is the maintaining reinforcer. So literature on, so over the years, I looked at this this article, which is kind of an overview of treatment of SIB that is automatically reinforced from 1982 to 2015, just because it would be, I thought this would be more useful than looking at individual papers, just because of the vastness of the research on this. So it shows pretty decisively that reinforcement procedures alone are less effective than when combined with other procedures. So very basically, a reinforcement alone produced an average of 52.5% reduction in SIB. However, it's interestingly, the effectiveness of those reinforcement alone procedures has increased over time. And that is in large part due to we're getting better at implementing and using preference assessments. So that preference assessment piece is really important, because it sometimes will allow us to avoid using more restrictive procedures, right? Oh, here's our third keyword. Dogs. Can't pass up dogs, right? Dogs are the best. All right, that's our third keyword. All right, and this table is taken from that same study. So just showing you, so this, these are all of your different reinforcement procedures over on the left. And this first column is when they were done without the addition of any other components. So you can see how, as you add on any of these, in most of these scenarios, DRO, you jump over and see that the effect, and this is the effectiveness, right? 30%, you can see that it jumps to 100% when you combine DRO with blocking or punishment procedure. So you're seeing, again, with the NCR here, NCR alone, you're at 75%, and you jump to 100% with the addition of protective equipment and restraint. So that's just to show, you know, and you can see here when DRA and NCR are combined, and then DRA and DRO and NCR. So you see this effect of, with the addition of and again, this is aside from like the implications of using protective equipment, blocking, punishment, right? This is just to show that you typically see a jump in effectiveness when you add additional components to a treatment package. And then this is to speak again to the effectiveness of, sorry, I'm trying to move my Zoom controls. How do I make the, there we go. No, go away. No, go away. There we go. Okay, so this is to show again the effectiveness of the treatments. So the black dots are successful treatments, which is 80% reduction in SIB or above. And then the clear dots are attempted procedures where the effectiveness was below 80%. And again, our timeline is from 1985 to 2015. So you can see reinforcement procedures alone, so with no extinction or punishment, have increased over time. The attempted have increased, and the successful treatments have increased over time. So we are seeing a slow increase in the effectiveness of reinforcement alone procedures, but we see a steeper increase in the use of reinforcement with additional components, and we see a smaller gap between attempted and successful. So there's a larger percentage of these interventions that are successful with additional components as compared to reinforcement alone. Okay, and then no reinforcement at all is at the bottom. So again, you're seeing the effect of the preference assessments, but you're also seeing this effect where we're more successful typically when we have additional components. Okay, hand mouthing. So this is our second example. With hand mouthing, this study is so cool. I would really encourage everyone to kind of look through it, although I included a lot of the graphs. So let's try to look through it. I hesitated a little bit to like add these many graphs, and I was like, we don't usually do this in these trainings. Like, it might be fun to look at some graphs. Maybe we have graph looking deprivation because we never get to look at graphs, and it'll be great. Okay, so in this study, this is Roscoe et al. 2013, so it's not super recent, but more than that IWATA study. In this case, 64% there were 64 participants, and 63 of them had this behavior was automatically maintained. So the vast majority of these cases came out as automatic reinforcement, meaning it was either it occurred in the alone condition or across all conditions. So we did see both of those results, but they're both called automatic reinforcement for our purposes here. Less than half of those were self-injurious, so there is some overlap here with self-injurious behavior, but it was less than half were cases where there was like injury that needed to be treated. So typically there was not any major injury. And then, so in this study, treatment was progressive. So they started with a reinforcement procedure, NCR, and then depending on the participant, we saw that this behavior in certain individuals was more resistant to treatment. So they added intervention as needed. Okay, so this first, trackball, it's too loose. I can't just do the one. So this is the first. You see these 6 participants here are the ones where NCR, non-contingent reinforcement. So they were just given access to preferred items. A preference assessment did take place in this study, I believe. And so there you can see the top line there is contact with those tangibles, with those reinforcers. And the bottom line, the solid dots, is the rate of our hand mouthing. Okay, so you can see just with the access to those preferred items, they're interacting with those items up here, and our hand mouthing drops to near 0. It drops all the way down to 0 here for Ted, and for all of these participants, we see them as they're interacting with preferred items, hand mouthing drops to basically 0. Okay, so NCR effective for 6 of these kids. Okay. So here's 2 instances where you see NCR is implemented right here after baseline the same way, but you see they're interacting with the items, but the hand mouthing here, these solid dots, either does not decrease very much at all, or it's super variable, like with Lisa, right? It's not, it didn't drop to 0. This looked promising, darn it, here we go, but it pops back up. So because NCR alone was not effective here, they added response blocking. So when we're talking about response blocking, means when they attempt to hand mouth, that attempt was blocked, which essentially we're talking about extinction, right? So the automatic reinforcer, that maintaining reinforcer, is we're making sure they're not accessing it by blocking the behavior from happening at all. Okay. And then so you see they still have access to the non-contingent reinforcement items. And when we add this response blocking, you see for both of these individuals, their hand mouthing drops down to much lower rates than in the other previous conditions. And then we have these other participants here. Where are we? Why is this happening? Where you have non-contingent reinforcement. No, don't come down there. And these you have the addition of a DRA. So not only is the response is blocked, so there's extinction in place, but they're also applying attention and praise when they're contacting the items. And then from the non-contingent reinforcement condition. So you have the addition of DRA with blocking. And then again, you see the contact with the tangibles increases and hand mouthing goes way down. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because we're running out of time. And then in the final condition here, there was one participant where you see here's non-contingent reinforcement. Here's non-contingent reinforcement with response blocking. And item contact is pretty high, but hand mouthing is still very variable. And so for this individual, they added a restraint component. So they added punishment, and you see, which was a brief restraint. So when hand mouthing occurred, they just held the hands in the lap for, I think, 5 seconds. So it was holding hands in the lap for 5 seconds. And you see when that NCR plus restraint is implemented, then the interaction with the tangibles stays very high, while hand mouthing goes way down to near 0 in that last condition. Okay. So I thought that was really interesting, the addition of all of those different components. And then the last example here is with stereotypy, and I think this is a really interesting discussion because this is the thing we probably see the most. I would say is, so we have either motor stereotypy, which is those hand flapping, those like repetitive motor movements, rocking, something like that. But we also have vocal stereotypy, which is repetitive vocal behaviors potentially. I think Holly, I think, brought that up as an example. So procedures there throughout the literature with stereotypy, there have been the use of all of these similar procedures that we just discussed. So all of those reinforcement procedures and the addition of extinction and punishment in similar ways as we just discussed. However, in this literature, it's very interesting. We've been seeing DRAs being implemented using the behavior itself, access to the behavior as the reinforcer. When we're doing that, some of those originally, the earlier ones, these Hanley studies I have in here, involve restraint. So they require restraint in order to make sure that the participant doesn't have access to that behavior. However, now newer studies, there's this the ability to add stimulus control. So you're adding a signal as to when the reinforcement for not doing the behavior is available. So this is a really cool study. Also, so these are older studies where we're using access to stereotypy as the reinforcer to increase durations of time where stereotypy does not occur. But this last study, I think, is really, really interesting and a great example of a treatment that that we could potentially use. There's no restraint. It's decreasing motor stereotypy in a 5-year-old boy with autism. And I love this as an example of when we might consider actually there's always this question of like, should we intervene with stereotypy, right? A lot of times it's like it's not interfering with anything, just leave it alone, but sometimes it can. And like, I love the statement from this paper. It just drove it home of it was reported by his clinical team and family that Luke did not interact with peers or adults when engaged in the motor activity and the motor stereotypy. He was about to start school in a mainstream classroom, and so the parents and the clinical team stepped in and agreed together that this was a priority to decrease this behavior. So I also love in this study, they did not just track stereotypy, they also tracked social interactions, and we see that as motor stereotypy decreases, social interactions increase. So this was really cool. They did a preference assessment, identified the iPad as the most effective reinforcer. And then they presented a contingency to this kid saying that when you have this green wristband on, you can access your iPad as long as there's no it was hand flapping, essentially. It was like a little bit of self-restraint. He would like wrap his hands in his clothes and hand flapping. So they gave him a little visual saying like no hand flapping equals iPad. And that worked. So over time, they just gave him the green wristband, gave him the little visual of the contingency. And when hand flapping did occur, the iPad was removed for 15 seconds until a period of 30 seconds without hand flapping. And then it was returned to him. So that was the training condition. And then eventually they moved on to a self-management phase where he was managing this procedure on his own. They would give him a token board and a timer, and he was setting the timer himself, and he was awarding himself tokens every interval that he went without hand flapping, and he accessed the iPad, and he was managing that contingency on his own. So that was, I think this is a super cool procedure that is accessible to us. It doesn't require restraint. Again, it's just that initial consideration of, is this a stereotypic behavior that we're going to intervene on? Does everyone agree on that? So up here in the upper left, this is our initial baseline. Here are the training sessions I just described of when the iPad was originally removed, the original introduction of the contingency. And you can see this behavior decreases pretty quickly after the introduction. And I think, again, they did a really great preference assessment. So having a powerful reinforcer here, I think, was a big piece. We returned to baseline and again implemented that treatment. And you have generalization. They thought of everything. You have generalization probes in here too. So they're doing this in different settings with different people and varying the reinforcer. They started varying the reinforcer. You can see there around session like 18 or something. And you know, motor stereotypy stayed at really low levels. And so under here, you see the second graph here on the bottom is when self-management started. So this is him. This is a 5-year-old kid implementing this procedure on his own, essentially. And you can see, especially, and as this is going on, our intervals increasing. So the amount of time he needs to go without doing the behavior is increasing to 4 minutes, then it's varied. And then eventually tokens are faded out. And you can see that this behavior maintains at very low rates throughout the entire time. And then finally on the right here, you can see this is his social interactions. The corresponding with those sessions. This mouse. And so the top box there is responses to when other people are interacting with him. And I also thought this was really good. This like validated, like Holly, some of us, we've been talking about how to measure social interactions. I love that they broke this up into responding to peers and initiating with peers. So I think that was kind of a great I was like, okay, we're on the right track. But you can see his interactions increase really significantly over the time that he's being treated for this motor stereotypy, which I think is very cool. So this is a really successful treatment of an automatically maintained behavior. So just really quickly, some important considerations. We inherently know less about the reinforcer, so these are harder to treat because of that piece. If we can't drill down on exactly what that reinforcer is, it's going to make it harder to treat. So these are going to require more complex treatment packages and more iteration. We're going to have to change it up and be more flexible and more nimble about our interventions. So we have to be assessing constantly, like keeping up to date with our data, looking at our graphs and making those changes as we need to, adding components as needed. Do your reinforcer and preference assessments. If you have a reinforcer procedure that's not working, do a preference assessment. Like, are we using the best reinforcers we can? And then treatment decisions again, and there's lots of ethical questions here. So there's lots of cultural, social validity things that we have to consider. So please keep all of those things in mind. Again, that's a whole nother training, but yeah, these things are gonna be discussions that you guys have within your team with your caregivers. And then our last keyword is turtle, because who doesn't love a turtle? I went 3 minutes over, but Rob didn't stop me, so
I was
We
having
started
fun.
late.
yeah, that's true. And then there's a bunch of references here too, guys. If you want to look through any of these studies, they're all in here. So we'll send it out. Any questions?
I think it was a very interesting training. Thank you.
Great, good. Thanks, Barb. I'm glad. Thank
Nice job.
you.
You can stop the recording.